last decade of the 20th century, time seemed to accelerate, and space became a virtual reality. A new generation fostered the digital revolution and formed a subculture movement called rave. An emerging underground shook apart the status quo using raves in cyberspace to engineer change. Cultural rebellion in the 1990s brought hackers and house music to the mix. Rebels became self-directed free agents plugged into the datasphere.
It was an idea that was expressing itself through the people participating in the culture. And all we had to really do is be ourselves. And, you know, to accept ourselves and to revel in ourselves. And that itself will bring about change.
I think it was Plato who said, the more I know, the more I realize I don't know. So, I mean, people that are questioning things and questioning things in an intelligent and kind of informed way are obviously going to be able to push things and make things different.
There are all sorts of hidden and wonderful remote high leverage points in the world we live in. It's sort of like being on a holodeck on Star Trek and realizing there are access panels hidden throughout this dimension if we go looking for them. You know, there are ways to hack this system.
We should all be interested in the future, because that is where we're going to spend the rest of our lives.
Computer networks. Cyberspace. Before the World Wide Web, internet travel was limited to scientists and a subculture of experimental amateurs. The concept of cyberspace came from the mind of science fiction writer William Gibson. His 1984 novel, Neuromancer, described a futuristic society where underground rebels inhabited a vast digital landscape called the Matrix. By the 1990s, Gibson's fiction had become fact. Forbidden thought and radical action were opened up to a broader base than ever before.
Well, Neuromancer was written in the wake of 1977, and I had been really increasingly uncomfortable with what had become of my counterculture. What I tried to do when I started writing science fiction, part of my agenda was to, I looked at the SF I'd grown up reading, in which there were no countercultures. We would get, okay, here's the future, and I'd say, well, where's the bohemian element? It was never there. So I decided to put that in.
I mean, I think if you look at what William Gibson sort of predicted in his books, or Marshall McLuhan before him, I mean, this sort of fragmentation, there's kind of a balkanization, if you will, of consensus reality. And I think that's very much troubling to the powers that be, because their view of the way things are, or the way things should be, rather, are not necessarily going to be the only input that you can get.
As Marshall McLuhan once said, we're extruding our nervous system as a species. We're growing an external, communal nervous system. And given that we're doing that, we are now to some extent able to hallucinate in communally, consensually.
One of the interesting things about cyberpunk and the coming of the computer age is that the preferred vehicle for science fictional exploration is no longer the rocket ship, it's now the computer. It's no longer a tool of war that belongs to the pig. It's a tool that everybody has on their desktop.
Youngsters are venturing into new and unwholesome worlds.
The origins of personal computing date back to the 1960s at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. By the early 1970s, Steve Wozniak and Steve Jobs, the pair who created the first Apple computer, began building devices known as blue boxes. Blue boxes were designed to break into AT&T's long-distance switching grid. Techniques for hacking into telephone systems spread. Underground hackers with pseudonyms such as Captain Crunch and Fiber Optic called it phone freaking.
If you go back to the software, hardware people in the 1970s, they were all people who were getting out of college in a time when being, countercultural, being dope smoking, being a little bit to the left liberal side of things, wanting power for the people and all that kind of stuff was ubiquitous. And when Jobs and Wozniak and Captain Crunch and all those people were creating the Apple and all the other stuff, this was, part of their motivation, and the free thinking environment helped to create the kind of consciousness that they needed to be able to come up with something as strange as thinking machines that would be available to people on a mass level.
By the late 1980s, computer hacking had grown into a covert subculture. As institutional computer networks developed, so did the private individual's abilities to tamper with them. William Gibson's vision of a cyberspace underground had become reality.
In the first explosion of this stuff, we had this wonderfully weird situation where there were these teenagers, in effect, hanging out in a deserted America. When fiber optic entered the net, entered the phone net illegally, there wasn't anybody else there. And I think that must have been the thing that was so intoxicating about it. It's like these guys broke into this infinitely large and undefended universe and more or less had free run of it.
They sort of created this cultural stream, taking that punk idea of do-it-yourself and applying it to computers and high technology. And it really influenced a younger generation of computer hackers and also people who are creative with, not just hackers, but people creative with the use of computers and design and all that, to have this idea that you can do it yourself, you can grab the stuff, use it, that you don't necessarily have to sign up with the corporate wave in order to create stuff.
Now in 1993, when the web takes off and drags the internet with it, all of a sudden the iceberg surfaces. The iceberg had been building for 30 years, but now it's immediate, it's visible, and it's interconnected with everyone across the world.
It's hilarious to think of what the sort of prankster possibilities could be, I think, on the internet. And I'm hoping that the sort of original hacker ethos of against the man, against these big corporations, of really just sort of throwing a monkey wrench into the system is going to be picked up on by a lot of people the world over.
We are making the social condition where any human being anywhere on this planet can say whatever he or she wants, and nobody can shut them up. That is an extraordinary possibility, because it means that all of those wonderful things that have been gelling in human consciousness all this time, that were shut down by the fact that they were too far out on the fringes to be incorporated into civilization, suddenly get a chance to have to be part of the mix. You've got a much more diverse ecology for thought. We're going from a relative desert to a rainforest in terms of ideas. And I think that's a good thing.
Cyberspace also attracted a notable rebel from the psychedelic revolution of the 1960s. Timothy Leary got his first personal computer in 1983 and quickly understood its implications for the evolution of human mind expansion. A pioneer in LSD research 2 decades earlier, Leary had speculated on the benefits of psychedelic experience. Now he was excited by the new cyberculture, seeing in it a natural extension of his previous work.
The prohibition against new ideas has been repealed in America. You can now go around talking about the future with confidence.
He was the person who got out in front and said, look, this may not be right, it may not be wrong, but it merits exploration. Let's at least be scientific about this. We've uncovered something here. We've uncovered a new human dimension, first with psychedelics and then with cyberspace. We've uncovered this human dimension of connection, of communication. Let's explore this because this is a valid human experience. And what he was literally doing was validating a corner of human experience that most people were not even really ready to accept existed, much less as a valid state of existence.
He felt that with virtual reality, you could generate or create these synthetic experiences which would enable people to have this much broader bandwidth of experiences. They'd be able to experience things which they would have never been able to experience before because they weren't tethered to their bodies, they weren't limited by time and space in the same way that we are now.
I think Leary's works on psychology, psychoneurology, evolution, cybernetics, computers, space. Most of his work is unknown to the people who think all he ever said was turn on, tune in, drop out. Most of his work is unknown anyway. If people did realize the depth and extent of his work, they'd begin to reevaluate him.
As Timothy Leary investigated the underground cyberculture forming in the early 1990s, he made several appearances at rave parties. Leary became an inspiration to thousands of young people who were encouraged by his open-minded views on consciousness expansion.
I remember the first rave that I know of that he came to up in San Francisco. There was a crowd of like a couple hundred hardcore San Francisco psychedelic rave people, and it was just like a natural connection, I mean, he's like an elder, basically he's like a tribal elder. For the rave culture.
So it's like very much rainbow psychedelic warrior ship, and having him as like a kind of wacky captain, you're all on board and it's like, ooh, captain, where are we going?
And a month after he died, I got an email from him that said, "Dear Bob, how are things over there? Things are fine on this side, but not what I expected. Too crowded. Love, Timothy." I don't know how he arranged that, but that was his last joke and one of his best.
I think there's a huge connection between the 60s and the rave movement, really. I think that I read the electric Kool-Aid acid test right when the rave movement was getting going, and I was completely blown away by that, too. It was like, wow. Because an electric Kool-Aid acid test, an event, was a rave. Straight up, it was a rave. You had a whole bunch of people, more or less on the same drug, having a group experience, being, manipulated by the lights and the sound.
My view is that rave culture is really chapter 2 of what the 60s was chapter 1 of. And it's the revival, moving forward of the basic project, of the whole 60s hippie counterculture, which was one of personal freedom, self-expression, and finding some kind of a communal unity, rejecting a lot of the values of a hierarchical, consumer-oriented society.
Raves began in the late 1980s, when DJs at private parties began mixing records and adding their own sample percussion tracks, making music called acid house. But it wasn't until British musician and performance artist Genesis P-Orridge began experimenting with acid house that a subculture rave movement would develop. Genesis P-Orridge's influence on underground culture began in the 1970s with a series of performance installations called the Coombe Transmissions. In 1975, he formed the band Throbbing Gristle, breaking new ground again with what was to become known as industrial music. In the 1980s, Genesis launched perhaps his most controversial artistic project. It was called Psychic TV, combining elements of industrial music with techno-pagan rituals, Psychic TV helped spawn the emerging underground house culture.
Though most people probably won't admit it, Genesis invented the acid house movement. You know, the cum transmissions and what he did. Listen to some of those early recordings, 71, 72, 73. I mean, that is the true lineage of ambient music. What Genesis did were rituals. These open-ended rituals where a whole bunch of people would come together. He'd make these sounds, and he wouldn't know where he was going or exactly what it was, but it was a transmission, both from him to his audience back.
I've always had this compulsion, if I think of something that seems curious or engaging, that I have an obligation to actually try and do it, whatever the risks. And I think that's true of many people that catalyze the way that society changes. Let's assume that what we're told we could be or we should be is told to us by someone with a vested interest in us keeping quiet, behaving and serving their purposes. That would make sense. That would be sensible if I controlled people to get them to do what I want. Therefore, if we don't do what people want, if we don't do that which is expected, the odds are we're doing something that's more to our own benefit, because something is suppressed by society deliberately. Therefore, we release it by refusal. And that's kind of how industrial music and industrial records first began.
I picked up a Psychic TV record and started reading the liner notes. And I was just floored by the liner notes, because it was Genesis basically going on about his theories of cultural transmission and you know, information warfare and stuff like that. And there was this incredible correspondence between things that were going on in my head that I hadn't really written down too much and what he was saying in these liner notes. And so, you know, I was floored by that. I was just really inspired. So, I mean, Genesis was always, as far as I could observe based on the information that was coming through about him, just way out there. Way out there, and that is rebellious just by virtue of how far he is from the rest of us, or the culture at large.
The techno-pagan thing grew slowly through cross-fertilization and observation of different threads. All these different cross-fertilizations grew into our own psychedelic events, but contemporized. And they would be very psychedelic and multicolored, and they would include all kinds of video of stone circles and non-Christian rituals. And it became a self-fulfilling prophecy, really. We ended up doing early versions of what became raves and drawing together crowds of people to have a consciously communal tribal event. And we were, at that point, also beginning to do technologically based dance music, what later became known as techno.
Genesis really was one of the first people in the music scene, in the youth cultural scene, not just in the literary scene, to say cut and paste is not just about language, but about reality. It's time to cut and paste this thing. It's time to deconstruct the world we're living in and inject ourselves into the system. And, you know, he had a rebellious way of doing it.
I took the dismissal of popular culture by the establishment and decided to really throw the gauntlet down and say, okay, guess what? You've got the real thing here. Now what are you going to do? We are serious and we are thinking. And we don't care about the music. We care about who's in touch with us and what they're doing. And we want them to think differently. And we want them to change the way they behave. And we even want them to change their sexuality. And we want them to be really rebellious. And we want chaos. And we want chaos to grow something new. What are you going to do about it?
He used art to attack society. And on that level, he's one of the great British eccentrics of the 20th century. And it's funny, his legacy is so hard to define but it's also so wide-reaching.
There was a really golden period with rave when it had grown and grown and grown on a completely underground basis without any real media coverage at all. And it reached a point where you could walk down the street in London and you could see people and recognise people that had been to raves just by looking at them. You knew. And there was no official reality whatsoever, no media coverage, and it was a real genuine underground coming together. And I think that it was a really historic point in my generation. I remember a really priceless moment of one of the early outdoor parties on the M25, where you basically got like 3,000 or 4,000 people partying in a field and really harming nobody. You know, it's just an amazing thing. Especially when, you know, you've got to remember at this point, like in the late 80s, this was an entirely new phenomenon, and no one had really, like, you know, no one had seen anything like this before in our generation.
House culture and raves spread to San Francisco, California in the early 1990s. An already well-established counterculture legacy from the 1960s meant there would be a comfortable fit for this postmodern underground movement. British rave promoter Mark Heley relocated there, bringing together cyber technologies and house grooves for the Bay Area's first raves called Toontown.
The experience of doing an event like Toontown was really, you know, like standing on the edge of history. You know, it really felt innovative and new. What this was always about was something a little bit deeper than just a party, and the agenda for cultural change has always been part of what I found interesting in it.
I think he was really instrumental in sort of marrying the rave culture to the cyber culture, because he was the first one I was aware of that you know, he would hook up with these major VR researchers in the Bay Area, and he'd have them bring their equipment into a rave, and he'd set it up and let people check it out, and it was sort of, you know, part of the experience. And I think that that's where the raves were cyber, was in the use of these consciousness-altering technologies.
Cyberdelic and the rave scene are perhaps the first truly postmodern form of bohemian culture or rebellion culture, where the enemy is no longer some external parent figure that has to be brought down or fought against. You know, the enemy is just ignorance. The enemy is in us. If there even is an enemy. Kids will go to a rave dance with anonymous music playing, not rallying around anything but one another.
It was like the ground was so right because of everything that had occurred in the past with from the beat poets to the whole 60s thing to the whole 70s funk. It's like it was all there and still is. So there was a lot more. I mean, you'd get all sorts of really amazing, you know, older, fantastic trippers at these parties who would help assist you in linking up the fact that this has been going on forever.
I was operating under this strong, intense belief that we could create a new space for ourselves. You feel a connection to other people, which makes you feel larger. And if that's a quote-unquote God, you know, feeling a connection to God by feeling a connection to all of these people around you, then let it be. You know, it's something bigger than you individually. It's not necessarily outside of us, it's just us, all together, you know, a belonging.
When I first went to a party and actually tripped out, this music was coming through this beautiful sound system and everything was completely clear. It was like hearing everything for the first time, and it was like a transmission, you know, like super planetary, interplanetary, dimensional transmission of music and sounds and words and mantras and energy.
The vibe is really the key thing that makes or breaks a really good underground party. And the vibe has to do with an attitude of openness and connection and spontaneity, moving together and getting into a common experience of raising energy together, basically. I mean, the vibe on the dance floor is where it's really pushed to its max.
What powers rave culture is the communal experience, everything else detached, totally focused in with the energy of the music. Time is completely irrelevant. You're unaware of your sort of earthly kind of surroundings. You're just in this sort of connected consciousness with thousands of other people, and it's like really powerful experience.
Largely unknown to mainstream society, rave culture had adopted a new drug as its mind-altering tool of choice. Known as Ecstasy or simply E, it was the latest technological breakthrough for expanding consciousness. A cyberdelic extension of what LSD had been in the 60s.
Ecstasy is not a psychedelic, or it's not a hallucinogen like some other psychedelics like LSD. It's not a major psychedelic. It produces a state that's very focused and precise in its effects. It produces a heightening of empathy, of a sense of feeling all right with oneself, all rightness with the universe, if you will. And so it was called the new generation of psychoactive chemicals.
There were a lot of great things happening in the rave scene as a result of people using ecstasy. And I think that people that were back there, they still remember it that way. You've got a group of people and they're all in more or less the same headspace, right? And that headspace is very pleasant. It is really, really pleasant. Suddenly, you can really appreciate yourself for who you are rather than who you think you should be, right? And you can also appreciate everyone else for who they are. And that's a great experience.
Like all drugs, it's something which should be used with caution, and people should understand what they're taking and ensure that it comes from a good source and that it is uncontaminated, and that they take the appropriate dosage, and also, do whatever is necessary, drink a reasonable amount of fluid to ensure their health and safety.
It's in the best interest of political leaders, social leaders to suppress drug use, because then people are less likely to question the prevailing cultural beliefs. Basically, what psychedelics do in particular is cause you to question your cultural beliefs, your beliefs about the world. Your cosmology changes. It opens up. I think it gets bigger and better as a result, but people in control might not agree.
Another innovation of rave culture was known as the smart drink. Formulations of amino acids and herbal extracts designed to enhance the house experience. Smart drinks were sold at early Toontown raves. The Smart Bar was operated by a young California woman calling herself Earth Girl. She brought a lively, hip sensibility to the new underground phenomenon.
We'd always had this whole good medicine show theme, and then we just set out and, brought this kind of like Lucy's psychiatric, like super crazy psychedelic lemonade stand to a place where the kids, because alcohol and E do not mix, and alcohol and dancing is really, really messy, and you're going to dehydrate yourself really quickly. So the whole idea was how to get you to the place that you needed to go to keep yourself high and happy and positive and, fully set for an entire night out.
Looking at the self as a finite biochemical machine, how can I enhance myself? Not just the idea that when you're sick you take a drug or you go to the doctor, but when you're well, why not make yourself better? I think that's kind of the underlying key idea behind it, which kind of unifies it with other aspects of this culture.
The combination of neurotechnology, of virtual reality technologies, of large screen projections using fractal imagery, computer-generated imagery, the smart bar movement, all of these things were natural things to put into this environment. It's like we're going into an environment and we're going to create something which is intended to produce an experience which liberates, and that was the design criterion of these events.
It touched a nerve in our collective unconscious, which contemporary culture is completely denied. You go to a rave, and because it was so new and a lot of people were on entheogenic drugs, there was just a lot of the social kind of barriers and class and race kind of barriers were sort of taken away for 8 hours. So that a lot of people that were involved in those kind of rituals said to themselves, man, this is the way it should be, you know, and went and made a culture based upon that.
The whole old structure and fiber, you know, of this like calcified nation state just like falling away at the seams because of the individual's awareness. And you look around and everyone else is doing it. And it's not just, I just don't mean on the drug culture, it's like everyone's like, you know, going for it.
Ravers, by and large, aren't really out to destroy anything. If there's a system they want to change, it's probably more like they want to tickle it to death. You don't take the monster head on, you know, because if you do, I mean, we've seen what happens throughout history. If you go straight up against the powers that be in a way that you know triggers their reactions, you get stomped on.
Cyberculture communities made their own alternative media space in the postmodern 1990s. The underground press was always a place where nonconformist perspectives could be heard. For counterculture tribes at the end of the second millennium, that place was called Mondo 2000. Devoted to revolutionary technologies and post-industrial lifestyles, Mondo 2000 and its creator Sirius became a window on the essence of the cyberculture underground.
Ari's crazy. He's brilliant and he's crazy and he's subversive. He's someone who has been, I think, integral in sort of midwifing the modern age. He's certainly been there agitating, covering, talking about it, writing about it, and making sure people knew about it, or that if they didn't want to, they were going to have to ignore him in the proposition. And Mondo reflected a do-it-yourself aesthetic about everything from virtual reality down to designer drugs down to music. And this is what it was really about. It wasn't afraid of technology. It wasn't afraid of the future. It was very pronoic. It thought that things were going to turn out well. But it also demanded that people who were involved in that culture be as intelligent, as well-educated, as well-read as they could be. So in that sense, the ideal Mondo reader back in 1990 was someone who was intelligent and experimental.
Looking at the flow of trends and countercultures and zeitgeists, I've always wanted to be able to tap into whatever was the essence of the cultural moment. And I think to some extent I did that with Mondo 2000.
Mondo 2000 was an amazing source of inspiration for me. I think that it was the first kind of voice for me of an emerging cyber nation.
A funny thing about the Mondo people was that none of them was really a computer programmer at all. The idea of hacking was more a matter of things that they would do with their own brains. Hacking the human biocomputer.
Sirius was the guy who put together a lot of these memes, a lot of these ideas into one place. He was really good at, and still is, but it was most important in the early 90s when these ideas were popping up. He was really good at looking at very different areas of culture and saying, oh, this is important. Oh, and that's important, and this is important, and putting them in his magazine or talking about them at the same time.
You told me that one time a guy who was, I guess, in the CIA said that, we read Mondo 2000 to keep abreast of what's going on in the underground, and he just laughed and said, that's really pathetic because we're making it up as we go along.
With corporate control of media outlets brokered into fewer and larger power blocks in the 1990s, cyberculture dissidents rallied against this ominous development.
That lead to a new and better mode of living for all of us.
The Immediast underground openly questioned the ethics of mega-corporate intrusion into public spaces. A practice known as culture jamming was adopted by collectives around the world.
For all of us.
The internet became an alternative to traditional media sources.
For all of us.
In 1996, disinformation launched its blend of anarchist and counterculture resources into cyberspace.
To a new and better mode of living.
Its sponsors, the giant media conglomerate TCI, were completely unaware of the website's content.
For all of us.
A cyberculture prankster had tricked corporate America into investing $1 million to promote social rebellion.
The whole story of how disinformation got funded is essentially the Emperor's New Clothes updated as a corporate fiasco in 90s America. None of them looked at it. The ones who did not want to admit that they weren't hip enough to get it. So everybody just sort of looked at me, non-comprehending look, said, "Oh, looks great." And we got over on it. I mean, in the one meeting where I actually presented the material to TCI, the guy who looked at it did a search on the search engine for Hitachi, of all things to type in, and the first thing that came back was sex, Scientology, Satanism, and suicide. And you would think that this might set off a few bells, but apparently not. I mean, when the meeting, I think, what did the guy say? Well, this isn't my type of thing, but I can see why other people would like it. The barriers to publishing, say radical or non-mainstream opinions have been eliminated. The printing costs, the distribution, things like this have been, they've fallen by the wayside. And now anybody who wants to publish their opinions and put it up on the internet can do so for basically the cost of a computer. It's within everybody's means to do that. And I think if you can make something that's compelling and sexy enough that people will want to read this, you can have a voice, and you can speak very loudly.
The purpose of the Immediast Underground is to get billboards, advertising, and commercialism and resign them to the museum of dead totalitarian experiments like the Soviet flag. What we want to see is the end of commercialism in communication. And the manifesto of the Immediast Underground, Seizing the Media, was actually public domain that encouraged people to replicate it, and in fact encouraged people to edit it and rewrite it to the way that suited the needs of their actual community and their public spaces. So when you do things, engage in tactics like that, you have a chance of kind of throwing a monkey wrench in corporate media.
Even the middle of the low road liberal point of view is no longer represented or allowed in the mainstream press for the most part. That's all deliberate. That's all corporate propaganda and attempted brainwashing through happy, fun shopping being dangled on a carrot on a stick. And that means that it's all that more important to the artist or the rebel to act as an information outlet, a town crier, a wake-up call.
The real underground right now are in places like pirate radio. It's in localism. It's in these community projects that don't have a mass emphasis. They're not alienated through different media. People are never content with a restraint on freedom and are always struggling for more. More cultural freedom, more freedom of speech, more public freedom in every possible way.
As ideas and methods for challenging the status quo are continually sent into the electronic datasphere at ever-increasing speeds, we may indeed be at the end of history. A social history shaped by conflict and dissent may be as old-fashioned as linear time itself. With cyberspace opening up a global mind, free from rigidly centralized authority, counterculture movements may soon become a thing of the past.
The way that countercultures affect us is really subtle and really, really pervasive because we mine them. The mainstream culture mines these areas for novelty. In a sense, I think that countercultures exist to produce novel material, which is then sort of selected out and put into the market and creates variety.
Corporate society has used the very handles of youth rebellion and cultural rebellion for its own uses. We've seen that in The Gap, we've seen that in MTV, we've seen that in a number of these corporations that get the very language and the very images of our rebellion and use it to turn profit.
These big corporations kind of encourage people to think that they are rebels and go and buy Levi's or use an Apple computer or whatever, you know, so it's sort of become very kind of twisted and morphed by the marketing men, you know. The economy is kind of structured itself in a way in which being different is actually kind of a good consumer choice.
The counterculture is either so quickly absorbed, co-opted, or so easily broadcasts itself into what was formerly called the overculture that the distinction has become irrelevant now. So the difference is that an idea stays countercultural for maybe 6 minutes at best, and then becomes, if not accepted, at least it becomes part of the overall operating system.
It's my belief that one of the problems of the world so far, or one of its evolutionary states which is coming to an end, is the binary system, the either-or system, the male-female, the good, bad, black-white way of perceiving everything, that's not actually how the universe is built, that's not how matter is, that's not how the brain is. Nothing is like that. It's a fallacy.
In the end, we've taken a look at politics as an institution and we laugh. We take a look at economics as an institution and we laugh. And yet we're faced with the contradiction that we live in a political culture and we live in an economic culture, and those things aren't going to change except at the individual level. And so individuals are making their own decisions on what they'll do for a living based on, I think, existential reasons, what's going to make them happy.
It's an entire dissipation of consensus reality that's happening right in front of our eyes, and you know, will be more or less complete, I would say, in 5 to 10 years. It's the coming of a time of chaos, which, depending on how it's handled, could ultimately represent a kind of victory for rebellious counterculture forces in the end.
I think the world has always consisted of the party of the future and the party of the past. And I've always felt myself to be a member of the party of the future, and I think that's a fun party to be a member of. You know, because the party of the future is optimistic by nature. And being optimistic is a hell of a lot more entertaining than being pessimistic.
Authoritarian systems depend on citizens acting predictably. Anything that enhances states of consciousness, such as hacking a computer network, or experiencing ecstasy at a rave, or tripping in virtual reality, will increase unpredictability. Big Brother is threatened when people take the tools of intelligence into their own hands. From the earliest Bohemian visionaries to the Siberian underground of today, dissenting voices have long been aware of this idea. The cultural rebel has always invited us to think for ourselves and to question authority.
This was a countercultural revolution that was amplified and disseminated through media rather than through word of mouth, you know, through computers rather than just through drugs and chemicals and songs. And because of that, it was a much more organic and I would say long-lasting cultural shift.
We're at this moment in time where with cyberspace, with psychedelics, with quantum physics, with the breakdown of literature into cut-ups, and with the conceptualization of art, and even with cosmetic surgery, everything is malleable. Everything can be different to how we expect.
We're going to see a generation of people in rave culture, in music, in the arts, in computers, who are really all built from the ground up to be individuals. Who's a rebel in that case? Is anyone a rebel? Everyone's a rebel, and maybe that's what we're going to, as a society that can tolerate and grow and be chaotic and love it, inside of a society where everyone's a rebel, where everyone's actually making their own individual statement, and not doing it in a way that's saying, I'm not that, but in a way that's saying, I am this.
This is the real action. The pot party. The trippers, the grasshoppers, the hip ones, all gathered in secrecy and flying high as a kite. Forget it, man, and get with the countdown. Take this square world and blast off for Kicksville. Everybody else is doing it. If he can handle bennies and beer, he should be able to handle a few harmless pucks. Under the proddings of the gang, the effects of the atmosphere and beer, the desire to belong, he chooses to go along. He's having kicks. He's away and flying. Up, up, out of this world.